All right, chapter 4 is about hormonal control during exercise, and specifically, we're going to talk about the hormones that regulate metabolism and also that allow for regulation of body fluids. There are many, many different hormones in the body, but we're not going to talk about all of them. We're going to focus on the ones that have exercise physiological ramifications. So, starting on the slideshow right now, we are on slide number 1, the overview. We will talk about what the endocrine system is, the various parts of the endocrine system, although some of the parts are going to have more of a play in terms of exercise and the acute and chronic effects of exercise on the endocrine system than others. We will talk about various types of hormones, their receptors, and what those hormones do, but not all of them. There are a couple of charts that we'll go through that make it a little bit easier. We'll talk about the endocrine glands and their hormones, the different types of hormones that come from different glands, the adrenal cortex, the pituitary gland, the anterior and the intermediate pituitary gland. Anyway, we'll talk about different endocrine glands and their hormones. We'll talk about how hormones regulate fuel processing and metabolism while we exercise, and how fluid levels can be maintained. And we'll also talk a little bit about calorie intake and why potentially hormones might make it so that you feel hungry or not hungry. And we may even talk about if there are strategies that companies use or that manufacturers use to regulate caloric intake or the hormones that are released that allow for hunger and satiety and things like that. And maybe they can use it as a marketing scheme so that they can sell more product. Anyway, the endocrine system are a series of glands, and those glands release hormones. Any of those particular parts of the human physiology that releases hormones is a gland. They're all known as the endocrine system. The nervous system sends communication throughout the body through electrical signals through the neurons, and those changes are usually very quick acting and don't last too long. The electrical signal is very quick, and it's useful to get the body to make changes online very fast. The endocrine system is chemical communication through the bloodstream. So typically, it'll take a little bit longer for those changes to occur, but the changes will last a little bit longer. If there's an issue typically with the neurons, then or with the blood, then the nervous and endocrine system can act independently of each other. So hopefully there won't be a massive disruption. What the hormones are going to do is maintain some type of equilibrium. They're going to control cell activity so that either nutrients, energy comes in, or if there's change outside the cell, there can be a regulating effect within the cell to keep things normal. The hormones are going to be released into the bloodstream, and they're going to travel to a target organ, and then on that particular organ there'll be receptors, secondary receptors, if not, or there will be target cells on the membrane of those particular organs that each of the hormones can react on. The endocrine system acts as a bit of a thermostat. So if there through negative feedback, if there's a buildup of byproduct or a buildup of things throughout the bloodstream, then that will trigger hormone release, and the hormones will do their job. Picture 4.1 on slide 5 just talks about the different the endocrine glands. There's the hypothalamus. There's the pituitary gland. Hypothalamus is going to regulate much of the internal functionings of the body in terms of blood pressure, heart rate, internal body temperature is like the thermostat of the body. The pituitary gland, there's the anterior, the middle, the intermediate, and the posterior pituitary. The intermediate pituitary doesn't really do too much, but the anterior and posterior pituitary release a number of key hormones throughout the body to that uh, impact many different things. The We'll also talk about the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands are just above the kidney, and catecholamines, adrenaline, epinephrine, those are released. We'll talk about the kidney with the kidneys. We'll also talk about the pancreas. The pancreas is involved with the production of insulin, and insulin is very important in terms of carbohydrate distribution and utilization during exercise, and also helps shuttle insulin to the central nervous sugar to the central nervous system, so the central nervous system can have fuel. So insulin is critical in terms of muscle contraction and also storage of sugars for use later, and also the creation of sugars through glycogenolysis or gluconeogenesis. So we'll talk about that. And also we have the ovaries and the testes, where testosterone and estrogen are created and released, and that is going to have big impacts on protein synthesis and tissue synthesis throughout the body. There are different kinds of hormones. There's steroid and non-steroid hormones. Steroid hormones are similar to cholesterols in that they have a lipid, like part of them is a lipid. Because of that, they are lipid soluble and can diffuse straight through the lipid membranes of the cells. Steroid hormones are released by the adrenal cortex just above the kidneys, the ovaries, and the testes, and the placenta. The adrenal cortex is going to release cortisol and aldosterone. We'll get to what cortisol and aldosterone do. The ovaries are responsible for estrogen and progesterone. Testes are where testosterone is produced, and there's going to be much more testosterone in males compared to females. Females is much more estrogen and also growth hormone. So we'll talk about the different hormones as we get to them. Non-steroid hormones are not lipid soluble, therefore they need to have some type of secondary hormone on top of the outer layer of the cell, so that the secondary hormone can attach to the non-steroid hormone and bring the non-steroid hormone across the membrane into the DNA, into the nuclei of the cells. There are two different types of non-steroid hormones. There's protein and peptide hormones, which are what most non-steroid hormones are. They're released from the pancreas, hypothalamus, and the pituitary gland. And you also have amino acid-derived hormones like thyroid hormones and also the adrenomedullary hormones, epinephrine and norepinephrine. Epinephrine is also known as adrenaline, and epinephrine and norepinephrine are both called catecholamines. Hormones are secreted by whatever the gland that is making them in little bursts, and that will allow for hormones to enter into the bloodstream, which will cause changes in that concentration of hormone in the plasma over a number of hours potentially, or it could last as short as a few minutes or so. So the amount of hormone in your bloodstream is not consistent. It fluctuates over days and weeks, and there are things that trigger releases of hormones. The main triggers are going to be things like stresses and also negative feedback. So when there's changes in the body and there's increases in, say, for instance, the byproduct of the breakdown of protein and amino acid, as those build up in the bloodstream, those are going to create a high threshold of those remnants, and that's going to trigger the gluconeogenesis hormones, cortisol and epinephrine and norepinephrine, to be released, so that those particles can be created into, or can be changed into, glucose if needs be. So when the byproducts of interaction start to pile up, that's potentially going to trigger hormone secretion, so that you can maintain some type of equilibrium. When bad things happen, hormones are released, and then the hormones can fix everything. We're on slide 9 right now. Um, Plasma concentration can be a poor indicator of hormone activity because as you exercise, there's a reduction in total blood plasma volume, which is going to increase the relative concentration of the hormones in the blood plasma. And also, there's the cellular layer, the cellular membrane that has all of the receptors for hormones can change sensitivity to hormones. So when somebody is insulin desensitized towards insulin, or they're downregulated, the number of receptors on the outer layer of the neurons reduces, which means that you need to have more insulin in order for the same effects to occur. So, just because there's a lot of hormone in the blood plasma doesn't mean that person is utilizing hormones or is able to utilize those hormones effectively. In fact, the sensitivity to that particular hormone can change depending upon number one, how much hormone is in the blood plasma, but also how much exercise individuals are doing. It seems as though, and we'll see a slide later on, it seems as though during exercise, blood plasma volumes of certain hormones reduce, especially insulin, and that's a little bit counterintuitive, but the reason that happens is because the sensitivity increases, and if the sensitivity increases, the pancreas has to work less to make the same effects happen, which is actually a pretty good thing. So down regulation is when the number of receptors is reduced during high plasma concentration. That's referred to as a desensitization towards that particular hormone. And if the number of receptors increases, that's called hypersensitization or upregulation. On slide 10. Okay, if there are no receptors on the particular target organ or the cell surface of the particular organ, then no hormone no hormone effects will occur. So there has to be a specific receptor with each hormone. It's one of the things when you give, similar to when you give somebody levodopa for Parkinson's, although that is a neurotransmitter, there needs to be a combination of the neurotransmitter and the receptor. And most of the Parkinson's disease medication are just ratios of the transmitter and the receptor. So very similarly, the hormone needs to have a receptor on the cell surface, and if there isn't, then that particular hormone will not be allowed to get through the particular cell membrane. Each cell has many, many thousands of receptors, and the receptor that the hormone binds to and the combination of the receptor and the hormone is the hormone receptor complex. Slide 11. Steroid hormone actions are lipid soluble, so therefore they don't have any problem going through the lipid cell membrane. The steroid hormone is found in the cytoplasm of the nucleus instead. So the steroid hormone goes right through the lipid bilayer, and the receptor attaches to the steroid hormone and ushers it directly into the nuclei of the cell, where it can start to cause DNA and genetic mutations. In most of the cases, it's going to create protein synthesis. So the testosterone and estrogen, those are all lipid-soluble steroid hormones that are going to cause an increase in protein and tissue synthesis when they get into the nuclei. Figure 4.2 is an artist's rendering of what's going on here. I'll let you guys go through it, or I'll go through it in class. There's an animation that also on slide 13 will help make a little bit more sense of figure 4.2. So go take a look at those two things. But we just talked about how a steroid hormone does not need a secondary hormone in order to get into the nuclei of the cell, to get into the actual cytoplasm of the cell. A non-steroidal hormone is not lipid soluble, and therefore it will need another lipid to help shuttle it through the cell membrane so that it can be absorbed by the or it can cross through the nucleus and start to take effect. Slide 14, we just talked about non-steroid hormones. They're not lipid soluble, so there needs to be a receptor. These are called secondary messengers. Sometimes the secondary messengers can even intensify the signal of the hormones. Common secondary messengers are CAMP, CGMP, and diacylglycerol. We're not going to really get into the specifics of each one of those, so they're just interesting to notice. Figure 4.3 is another rendering of how a non-steroidal hormone is able to get through the bilayer. It does so because the secondary hormone attaches to it and through a series of processes pulls that non-steroidal, non-lipid hormone through the cellular membrane. There's an animation again on slide 16 that you guys can take a look at that will get you there. There's a potentially third class of hormones called pseudohormones or sort of hormones called prostaglandins. They're not derived from protein, nor are they derived from fats. They're derived from arachidonic acid, and they're local hormones that typically affect other endocrine glands. They deal with swelling and vasodilation. So when the body is in need of extra oxygen when it's doing high intensity activity, they will potentially come into play. There are many different endocrine glands in the body, and each can produce one or more than one hormone. There are many different hormones that regulate physiological variables during exercise, both acute and chronic. The major endocrine glands responsible for metabolic regulation, or the control of calories in and out of the bloodstream and absorption of calories, and the utilization of different sources of fuel, namely carbohydrate, protein, and fat, and when those particular macronutrients are utilized for fuel are the anterior pituitary gland. It's in the brain. The thyroid gland is in the throat. The adrenal glands are just above your kidneys, and the pancreas, which is just behind your stomach. Hormones released by these glands affect the metabolism of carbohydrate and fat during exercise. They're either going to store carbohydrate and utilize carbohydrate at a later date, or they're going to try to utilize carbohydrate now and take any fat that's stored, change it into carbohydrate if we don't have enough, so that we can use carbohydrate for fuel. Video 4.1, I'm sure you'll be able to take a look at that. It'll be self-serving. Slide 21, the anterior pituitary gland, the posterior pituitary gland, they are both very important in terms of the secretion of particular hormones. The intermediate pituitary gland doesn't seem to really do too much. The pituitary gland is attached to the bottom bottom part of the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is one of the key regulatory glands in regards to blood pressure, heart rate, and the